And you will leave a few minutes, Kelly, after the top of the hour for people to kind of filter in.
Yeah, there's people just starting to come in now. Oh, they're all coming in now.
It sounded to Kelly, we're asking them to put questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. Is that right?
Preferably, yeah.
Okay, so I'll try and check that Q&A.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, go ahead, Florette.
It's fine, thank you.
Okay, we'll just give it a little bit more time. We're just waiting for a few more people to join. Does that sound good to the hosts?
Absolutely.
Welcome. We have some people from all over the place today. That's great. Okay, I think we're going to get started. We are welcoming everybody here from everywhere, including India, from the Envision Sustainable Infrastructure Framework. I would like to welcome Eric and Laurette, and I have a little summary about the two of them, and I'm having a bit of an issue trying to get their little presentation up on to talk about them a bit. My name is Kelly Murphy. I am with the region of Durham, and I am a project engineer there, and I am also an ENVSP. I have the designation for about 4 or 5 years now. Laurette just became the Envision Canada program manager. She is with the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering, and I will let her talk a little bit more about herself. Eric is the sector lead for Pratis Group, and he was on the project and I think lead for the first Envision verified project in Ontario. So these two people are very qualified to speak about Envision sustainable infrastructure, and I'm so pleased that they were willing to step forward and be a part of this presentation and webinar today. I will take through some housekeeping items on the, I think it's, yep. So you're going to be muted throughout the whole presentation. I'm asking that anybody who has questions to post them in the Q&A, and it's being recorded. And this presentation and webinar will be accepted for continuing education credits. So your record of attendance can be provided as required. So the Q&A at the end, we will go through the questions and answers. And if we can't get the answers to you today, we will make sure that they will be provided at the to everybody at the end. And from that, I'm going to pass it off to Eric for the agenda. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kelly. And thank you everyone for joining us today from near and far. Laura and I are happy to be here with you today. So today we're going to go through a pretty wide-ranging discussion on Envision, talking a little bit about what it is, what the intention is behind it, part of the role of the organization that Lorette is representing, so Envision Canada, then going to a bit more of a deep dive of the overall framework, talking a little bit about some of the projects that have been awarded certification under this program, and then a little bit more of a philosophical discussion on value and applied lessons learned from some of the work that we have done together. And finally, if you are interested from today's session, there are going to be some information around how you can do some further training if you wish to continue to develop your own career in this directory. So a little bit about us. So yes, Kelly gave our introductions there. I will say that Lorette and I have had the pleasure of working together for about the past 10 years in various iterations. So it's nice to be here with her today. My job currently is sector leader at Pratis Group, which is based in Toronto. We do a wide variety of services, including building certifications and other kind of third-party sustainability frameworks, much like Envision, and also building performance and energy modeling and looking at decarbonization of existing buildings. So that's really the work that I've been most familiar with. I've been also in the clean technology startup side, and I've been spending most of my career looking at sustainable technologies, development standards, frameworks, guidelines, kind of you name it on that front. Lorette, would you mind sharing a little bit about your current role and maybe some of the other things that you do in addition to your role with the CSC?
Sure, thank you, Eric. Yes, thank you everyone and welcome. Like Eric said, and Kelly mentioned, I'm just started recently in the role of Envision Canada Program Manager. We'll talk a little bit in the presentation about Envision Canada and what that is and is not. But that's a very exciting time, I think, for Envision in the Canadian context. So I'm honored and pleased to bring my experience to this role and this ongoing effort. I've been involved with Envision since the outset in 2012 and became an Envision professional in 2013 and have worked with various public agencies at all levels to embed Envision in their projects, their contracts, and to utilize it as a system for improving the infrastructure performance. Beyond Envision, my background's in landscape architecture and planning, a little bit in asset management. So I look forward to bringing some of that diversity to the discussion as well. Great,
thank you, Lorette. And yeah, I think we were among the first 20 people in Canada who had the designation for Envision, so it has been quite some time. So kicking things off, I am going to spend a little bit of time talking about what Envision is, and then Laura's going to share a little bit more information about the approach in Canada and some of the current statistics of application. So when we think about Envision and we talk about it today, it's really important to understand that this is purely voluntary. So this is not regulated or mandated. This is not something that anybody has to do. So if you are worried about something being thrust upon you, that is not the purpose of the discussion today. What it is it's ultimately a third-party design, sustainable design framework. So it is meant to really provide guidance, best practices, just in different ways so that you can look at your own project delivery and improve how those projects are performing against the kind of three traditional aspects of sustainable design, which we would consider to be environmental, social, and economic impacts. Envision does also offer an optional verification or certification program. So if you deliver a project that you feel performs very well against the guidelines that are offered, you could then opt to pursue an official certification that requires third-party review, and then you would be granted an official award. We have some actually exciting and very timely news on that front relevant to our friends here in Ontario, which we will cover as part of the presentation today. This framework is intended to be applicable to all forms of infrastructure, everything from energy to transportation to water treatment to community development, all the kind of traditional things that municipalities here in Canada are often tasked with doing, often with very limited budgets and very limited resources. But nonetheless, all of those infrastructure sectors are covered by Envision, and it's meant to be all-encompassing. So this is not about just a road or just about a wastewater treatment plant. It is meant to be broader than that. Again, this is really looking at the project level. This is not assessing an organization based on its capabilities. It is not looking at overall organizational structures or anything like that. It's really looking at the execution of individual projects. So, a self-contained beginning and end of a project design through construction and completion. This program is also administered by the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure overall, which is a not-for-profit based in Washington, D.C. And here in Canada, that role is being represented by the CSC. So again, what types of infrastructure is Envision primarily interested in? And it is, again, looking at a pretty broad swath of project types. So everything including energy generation and distribution, water treatment, flood control, stormwater management, solid waste, transportation projects, including transit and traditional roadways and railways, ports, airports, landscape projects, and information projects. Although I don't know if we've yet seen any projects on the IT side actually move forward, but we have seen projects in every other category that have been announced that have utilized Envision so far. So one question you're probably all asking yourself is like, why another one of these things? Why another sustainability framework? Why are we looking at a different tool? We have things like LEED. We have things like the net zero building standard. Why are we looking at this in this way? And really, for those of you who spend your lives thinking about infrastructure, what you've probably encountered if you've ever used a tool like LEED is that really a lot of the existing frameworks outside of Envision are really building focus. They're really focused on things like operations and maintenance. They're focused on things like human occupation. And there's some specific nuances to infrastructure that do create the need for additional different lens, the way that Envision is meant to work. So under Envision, what do you mostly get concerned about? You would be looking at things like how the facility is actually operated. And this again looks at the fact that in the infrastructure world, assets tend to be owned and managed by the municipality who builds them much longer than the vertical building space, where often office buildings or residential buildings are built and then transferred to a different owner. Also under Envision, there is greater concern for things like stakeholder engagement, reflecting the fact that many publicly funded projects must, by their own necessity, look at what the local community thinks, feels, wants, expects from the asset that is being designed. Whereas private sector developers, they are concerned about that, of course, but not in the same way that a publicly funded entity would be. Tied very closely to that is this concept of community impacts. So infrastructure by nature is very interconnected. It often coexists or co-inhabits spaces with other forms of infrastructure. And therefore, there's a much greater concern to looking at how that will function as a whole versus as one discrete project site where an office building might be built one day. And that again reflects the next bullet, which is network interconnectivity. Without a wastewater treatment plant, you don't have sewer pipes. You don't have perhaps some of those connections with roadways, different other forms of infrastructure that all talk to each other that need to be considered when you're designing your project. And then finally on the list, this is a new one for many of you on the line, I'm sure, but the concept that as our climate is shifting around us, many of these assets, especially on the infrastructure side, are going to be challenged to play more than one role. They may also be playing a role for emergency preparedness. They may be performing a resiliency function. They may need to be designed in a way that considers 50, 75 years from now what the ambient climate considerations will be. And that really, I think, is an important part to all of this, is that sustainability traditionally didn't look at many of these aspects in this way, but under Envision, resiliency is included. And so again, obviously all of this, I'm talking about the infrastructure side, and on the building side, the inverse is true, is that all of these bullet points are less critical. They're not critical. And obviously I would say a good building design would consider many of these things as well, but they are not as salient under different frameworks that look at buildings. One other final thing I will say is if you have ever designed something like a pumping station or a wastewater treatment plant, you will know that many other sustainability frameworks have requirements or prerequisites that basically precludes those buildings from getting those certifications, because they have things like minimize energy, consumption. You have a building that is basically a shell that is meant to pump water 24/7. It is typically not possible or not very easy or valuable for those types of buildings to use those sorts of frameworks as a result. So I'm going to pass to Laurette to talk to us a little bit about Envision Canada.
Thank you, Eric. And before I jump on Envision Canada here, just kind of adding to what Eric is sharing, I think one of those other reasons why the Envision rating system is beneficial to public agencies is the fact that it crisscrosses so many different infrastructure types that public agencies tend to not just specialize. Some do, but if you're a municipality, you deal with roads, you deal with the wastewater treatment plant, pump stations, you have parks, and the benefit of the Envision rating system is it provides that common language in a public agency that allows the different departments working together under kind of one common framework, no matter what the different sector type projects are. So, some of these benefits is recognized by Canadian Society for Civil Engineering and have been long supporters and ongoing work with the ISI who administers the Envision rating system. And I should be clear that Envision at the outset, when it was created through Harvard, ISI, the partners, it originated as an idea out of the United States, but it isn't a system that was purely developed for the American context. Like I mentioned early on, Eric and I were involved in very early days of Envision on various technical committees and volunteer positions and such to represent a Canadian voice as part of the system, and it has been applied and received awards in Canada. So while the partnership between CSCE and ISI is newly announced last year, the framework and its application isn't new in Canada, but it's that recognition of let's say a few years of piloting and applying it in Canada to recognize that this is the framework of choice for infrastructure systems, and CSCE has dedicated through my role and its commitment to advance the Envision uptake in Canada at all levels of government, and that might involve working with the federal governments, Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and others on its use and how we can support our communities in demonstrating sustainability. It also involves training and making sure we have the capacity and the professionals and the NVSPs there to support the demand for the system. And then to look at innovation in the Canadian context specifically. While the system is very applicable to Canada, there's always some nuances where we can do better in reflecting its application in specific Canadian context applications. And so the partnership through Envision Canada isn't there to replace ISI. ISI is still the administrator of the system. It's credentialing the awards and such. But through CSCE's partnership in Envision Canada, it really helps us to give it a voice in Canada and to support our Envision professionals and the public agencies in its application. So, as I mentioned, it's been around for a while, and so in Canada, I'd say globally, there's currently something like 200, almost 300 projects that has either received award or is an active registered projects working with Envision. In Canada, we have about 10% of that right now represented, and most of our projects reside in kind of the provinces of Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia as the early adopters of the system. And important to recognize that there's always this lag time, especially with infrastructure projects that last a long time, that it sounds like nothing is happening, and then suddenly there's a number of awards, but it's just because these projects might take 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. So it's good to see that there is such activity, and giving an indication that we'll be seeing some awards coming in Canada in the years to come. Most of those looking at the different sectors of how that is broken down, transportation sector is kind of leading with about 70% of the applications right now in Canada. And wastewater treatment plants type projects following, but you could see there is a good representation of some of these other types of projects as well. As far as the kind of public sector users that we're seeing, this is by no means a comprehensive list of all of them, but just wanted to give you a sense of some of the different public agencies that has or are using Envision on one or more projects. Some agencies such as Metro Vancouver having gone as far to make it a requirement for all projects over a certain threshold. And so we're seeing more of these examples of whether it's trying it on one project, using it as a benchmark for our organizational response, or on the other extreme, making it the standard for all projects. As far as the number of professionals and organizations in Canada continues to grow exponentially year after year. You could see there some of our corporate members and the public sector members, and of course there's some benefits and discounts on project and application by being a member of ISI. And the Envision professionals and trainers and verifiers continue to grow in Canada as well. So we have a good practice that's establishing.
Great. Well, thank you, Laurette, for that summary of where things stand in Canada. And I will say it's nice to see those numbers rising. And as you said, it's always interesting because there's such a lag period between people tinkering and playing around with things. And then years later, you see what they've built and designed, and the awards come out. So I'm going to turn now to talk about some of the nuts and bolts of Envision. So this is kind of the meatier side. And again, if anybody does have any questions throughout this section or any of the following sections, please do just post them in the Q&A. We'll make sure to cover those at the end. So again, when you think about Envision, like what is it? What is this thing actually about? There are a couple of key components. The first one is the guidance manual, which is shown here on the right. This is kind of like the Bible, so to speak, of Envision. It is many hundreds of pages long. So if you really wanted to lose yourself for a weekend, that's going to be there for you if you're interested. That really has all of the guidance, all of the recommendations, all of the kind of ways that this is structured and evaluated. So we will spend some time today going through some of the key components of the manual. In addition to the manual, there's what I will call more of a quick and dirty type approach, which is this pre-assessment checklist. This is really meant for you as kind of like a gut check to say, hey, am I looking at all the things I maybe should be looking at in my project? Are there gap areas we should be thinking about? What might this look like if I were to go through the full kind of evaluation myself? The third component, arguably the most important component, is the people involved. So this is the training credential, the certification. So you heard Kelly at the beginning talk about having the ENVSP credential. That is again awarded to anybody who has completed the official training and has done the test and passed. Finally, of course, there is the actual verification and awards. Only a subset of projects will ever do that. And again, there are many hundreds of projects, as Laura mentioned, that are in that kind of pipeline of achieving certification. There are likely many thousands of projects that have used Envision in some respect, but I have ultimately opted not to go for that award. So I will spend some time talking about that a little bit, but it's not really the main focus of the conversation today. So here's a little snapshot of that pre-assessment checklist. So this is again very high level. What it does is it asks users to quickly go through their project design and assess questions of whether or not they are looking at certain attributes of sustainability and resiliency, and just select yes or no. This is a pretty basic Excel-based tool. So many people in the engineering side will be very familiar with these sorts of things. And again, it's provided at no cost. It's really just there for you as a tool to look at your projects through a different lens. Now, looking at the manual, we're going to dig into this one a little bit more because this is, again, kind of the main points. The manual itself is kind of the how-to guide. It's going to tell users what they might want to consider, how they might want to consider taking action on various sustainability topics. And in fact, there's a total of 64 different credit criteria. So I'll use that term credit, which again is really just a concept. It's a sustainability topic that might be of interest to a project that is being designed. So you'll hear me say credit or criteria, they're really the same thing. And that's, again, language you might be familiar with from other frameworks. In Envision, however, it's assessed always on this 5-point rating, which they refer to as levels of achievement. And those levels of achievement range from improved to restorative, where improved is going a little bit beyond what is kind of the minimum requirement, while restorative is the maximal level of achievement that anyone could potentially earn on an individual credit or criteria. This manual, again, is free to download. There's no cost to it. So if you register for an account, you don't even have to actually pass the test. You can get access to this manual at any time. So the general principles of the manual and generally the principles of the framework overall is that there are these following 5 bullets, or what I would consider to be some of the key principles. Firstly, being that there are no mandatory credits for topics. So you could, in theory, avoid half of the overall framework, and that's okay. It really has to do with the context of your project. So a roadway project is very different from a power plant. It's very different from wastewater treatment. The topics that you might consider as material or relevant to your design are going to vary significantly. And in light of all of that, there are actually no minimum prerequisites. So that's important. So Envision, I hope you take from that as it's very flexible, and especially in comparison to other frameworks that are out there. It also looks at incremental performance rather than an all or none kind of principle. So again, here, those 5 levels of achievement are meant to show an incremental stepwise approach going from, again, the minimum requirement up to what would be considered optimal performance. So you can look at that and decide that you're willing to go one step further, but not the whole way. And it's not a binary decision. It's not like you would, be told that performance is worth nothing unless you do all of these things. There are some incremental steps along the way. The framework also includes explicit objectives to restore assets rather than simply mitigating damage. So one of those levels of achievement you heard me describe was called restorative. This is the idea that some forms of infrastructure can actually restore existing conditions and improve the ecosystem or the environment around it in a way that's actually net positive. And that's an important concept, is that especially as we look at a world where we have had such a significant impact, where there are opportunities to restore, let's say, pedestrian flow, let's say wildlife corridors, natural floodplain functions, that Envision actually looks at that and provides credit for doing so. The guidance is also focused on the planning and design phases. There are considerations involved for construction, and I would even argue a little bit into the operations phase, but it really is a planning and design tool. It's really meant to cover everything up through construction at best. So it doesn't have a lot to say yet around decommissioning or operations, but it's really looking more at those upfront phases. And finally, a really important one here is that the performance that one could achieve under Envision really has to be reflective of the full project team. So if you have consultants, if you have designers, if you have architects, if you have contractors, every one of those partners has a role to play. And perhaps even more surprisingly, even within your organizations, there may be roles that your city council plays or that your senior leadership plays that could be reflected in credit scoring under individual Envision credits. So let's look at a credit. So here's one here. This is probably a familiar topic for many of you, which is this one is looking at recycled materials. So, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We've known that using recycled materials has been important for all types of projects for a long time. And Envision, of course, does include a credit that looks at recycled materials. What you will see if you ever download the manual is that every credit will look similar in terms of framing and structure. So what you're going to see here is a little bit of a walkthrough of one of the credits, but it really is representative of all of the credits. So here you can see it with the arrow that it's pointing to the fact that the credit is always accompanied by this intent and a metric. So it is going to tell you this is the purpose of this credit. This is what you are supposed to be thinking about. And the metric will tell you this is how you will actually be measured or scored or for you to score yourself if you're interested in improvement. And then below that, you're going to see the levels of achievement, which will provide more detail. So in this case, again, the intention of this credit is to avoid the use of virgin materials. The metric is going to be the quantity of materials that you use for the project that are sourced from reused or recycled sources. Now, again, looking at those incremental levels of performance or levels of achievement, you can see here that this credit will enable you to consider 4 different thresholds of performance, everything from improved to conserving. In this credit, you will see that the restorative option is actually not available. And so they have deemed that it's actually not possible to net benefit society in this case. Maximally, what you're going to get is 100% use of renewable materials. That's the greatest performance you can achieve. You can see here in the levels of achievement that they range from what we would consider to be a relatively minimal level of performance. So again, the improved threshold is looking at as little as 5% of recycled materials, whereas the conserving, the highest level threshold, is looking at 50% or above. And you can see there that in terms of the measurement criteria, it is using calculations based on weight, volume, or cost. So an important point here is you don't get credit just for doing status quo, generally speaking. But if you are in a municipality or area where there are requirements for you to use recycled material by default, you might actually be already achieving some of these things by default. And that's a good thing. And you would actually earn credit under this framework for that purpose. Now, looking at, again, the intention here is to offer progressive guide to increasing performance. I think I already covered that section, so I'm just going to skip to this one here. This is a kind of a more zoomed out view of the credit, and this is actually 2 pages taken from the manual itself. You won't be able to read this text, so don't be too concerned about that. But what you will see this arrow pointing to is that in the manual, there are specific instructions or guidance provided that would tell you how you would be able to document or demonstrate or move forward with achieving the credit itself. So in this case, it is asking, what's the overall quantity of materials? Can you provide an inventory of those materials? Are you aware of the recycled content of every material? And can you create some calculations that would prove and document that that is actually the case? So again, the manual is very much structured around 2 things. One, providing you with guidance as to how to use this credit in real life. And then, of course, pointing to you what kind of documentation would be useful if you would ever wish to have somebody else review your project. So the 64 credits I talked about before are covering 5 categories, and they're quite different. So you'll see here the 5 categories are listed kind of in the center of the screen. The first is what we will call quality of life, which looks at things like community well-being, mobility, and overall just community feelings toward the project and integration. The leadership category has a lot to do with the organization. So how well has the project team collaborated with its stakeholders and partners? How well was project planning completed? And what's the overall economic impact of this project on the community at large? The resource allocation credit is really all about materials, energy, and water. So things that might be consumed as part of the project. The natural world is about our ecosystems, ecology, siting, natural conservation, kind of the more traditional green type things. And the final credit category is on climate emissions and climate resilience. So again, looking more at those risk and vulnerability perspectives. I'm not going to dwell on these. I will show you them. It's a lot to take in. And again, if you are interested in picking out any of these individual credits or questioning what kind of guidance is in here, what do they actually mean by things like improving construction safety or advancing equity and social justice, I would encourage you to go to the website, which we'll share here towards the end, and just download the manual. You can read these in whatever detail you wish. So I'm just showing you these as an idea so that you have a sense of what some of the topics are. So under the leadership one here, you can see that there is things like fostering teamwork and collaboration, stakeholder involvement and engagement, and then looking at probably things that might seem a bit more esoteric, like could we actually get byproduct synergies? Can we do things that make use of different strategies that provide dual benefits? Can we conduct a life cycle economic evaluation? So these are things that are probably less traditional, whereas some of the other criteria around stakeholder engagement are probably things you've been doing for years already. Under the resource allocation credit, again, this is what I would consider to be some of the more traditional sustainability topics for measurement, things like energy consumption, things like renewable energy, water consumption, procurement, all of these very like material-based considerations. Natural world is going to be familiar to many of you who spend time on the environmental engineering side. So this is everything from habitat protection, restoration, to pesticide use and fertilizer use, to groundwater, wetlands, invasive species, farmland, anything that's considered, a natural asset as part of the land. And apologies, it looks like I forgot to change the title here. This is actually natural world. And the final section, again, this is all about greenhouse gases. So the first chunk of the emissions credits is really about air pollution and GHGs. And the other half of this section is looking at things like climate vulnerabilities, mapping out what future climate scenarios might be, and avoiding development of infrastructure in places that might be at risk. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what Envision is really meant to entail or what it's meant to promote. So one of the first items that Envision really is pushing for, and I think that perhaps one of the reasons why CSC has seen value in this, is that this is looking at promoting the idea that there is a benefit from taking an integrated design approach. So you'll have heard this term, is my guess, the idea that rather than using kind of a traditional design bid build, a very linear approach, to the extent possible where you're able to incorporate partners from the whole value chain. So having contractors be consulted during design, perhaps working with partners that normally wouldn't be brought in until down the line, and avoiding kind of the factory line approach to design, which often we are all living through. And so asking us to think outside of that and wondering, what might this design choice do to someone else and their discipline? If I make this choice about energy systems, is that going to affect the landscaping? Is that going to create a problem if I mask this part of the structure a certain way? Those sorts of considerations are really promoted by using Envision. And this really, again, gives credit for using these processes that would get individual specialists to talk to each other and understand and consider the impacts of how those choices might work. Higher performance here really relies, again, on a pretty good alignment and communication system between the owner, between its consultants, and the contractors that are brought on board. And really here, I think this has been a personal learning or personal observation, is that what good is a certification, or what good is an assessment if it doesn't teach us anything about what to do differently the next time? And actually, I would go one step further. What good is a framework or a certification if it doesn't actually benefit the project in real time? So if we go through the design of a project and then we submit a bunch of information and maybe it gets an award, great. But the question I would have is, how often is your organization going to do that project again in the future? Will the same partners be involved? Will the same staff be involved? What kind of organizational learning can be developed through that approach? And one thing that I think is always kind of perhaps understated, it's embedded in these frameworks, but perhaps not broadcast, is that having effective internal feedback loops, having someone who's actually consciously thinking about these issues from beginning to end is really important. Because if you've been on projects like the ones I've been on, it's actually very challenging to go from a concept or a vision at the outset where the asset owner is saying, I want this to be very considerate of social impact. I want this to be very reflective of the natural environment. But as you go through down the line, from architecture to engineering to contracting to material suppliers, there's lots of places that that communication or that vision can be lost, or it can be warped. And that, I think, here's what we're saying, is that looking at this as a living approach, as something that requires communication to flow not only downstream, but back upstream in an effective way, is really important. And unfortunately, no framework is ever going to do this for you. This has a lot to do with personal capacity and experience. But there are, again, triggers in Envision that would push you to put some of these sorts of frameworks in place. Restoration. So I've spoken about this one a lot. And again, I think this is a really important one, especially as municipalities in particular are stewards of public funds, which is that when possible, Envision is really asking you to consider can I not only make my project less impactful or greener, so to speak, but could I do something that might actually undo some damages that are already done? And again, this concept they refer to as being restoration. I would say what we have seen, like when Envision first came out around 2012, really no framework was talking about net positive or restorative impacts. What we are starting to see is other frameworks are borrowing or like, also bringing this into their structure where they're looking at asking project teams to go beyond just like not causing more damage and actually looking at things that could add a net value. So one of the project pictures you're seeing here on the right, this is actually in Grand Bend. This you can see used to be the site of a sewage lagoon. They had to upgrade this facility. And when they did so, they opted to use one of the lagoon sites and construct a wetland to mimic what might have been there before development. So that's an example of thinking that really looks for opportunity to reuse some of that impacted space to restore some natural functions. Climate resilience, again, so this is a major component. There's a whole credit category on that. And this is really a key focus, and it's the idea that we should be in our designs and our projects considering not only current conditions, but also potential future conditions and what some thoughtful design choices might be that might help limit impacts both on the project site and off the project site. And this is not new. Again, you might already be doing some of these things. So there are tools out there that you might have heard of, like this PIBC protocol, which is popular here in Canada. The federal government has funding requirements that include using tools like their climate lens methodology. You might even work with organizations like ICLEI that have their own kind of framework and structure to think about climate issues. And all of those things are cool. Like Envision's not asking you to do a specific approach. It is inclusive and accepting of all of those tools. So if you have projects who have used those systems, I would hope that firstly, they've offered value and that you've made changes based on what the findings of those studies have said, but also just know that that sort of information could be and should be included in Envision or sustainable design overall. And then flexibility again. So I mentioned this earlier, but looking at these projects, like here's two examples on the right. These are actually certified projects. One is a hydroponics farm in Hawaii. The other one below, I believe, is a part of a wastewater treatment facility in Maryland. They can be very, very different, and their intentions are different. Their considerations are different. Their users are going to be different, and the types of impacts they can have are very different. So all of that to say, it's really important for any kind of sustainability guidance for infrastructure to be very flexible, and that is what you will find if you look at the manual. There really is no prerequisite, as I said, so you can pick and choose from things that offer you real value and not just chasing things because you have to. And again, if you could look in there and you say, well, maybe these 8 credits are the ones I care about the most, and I'm going to refer to that guidance, that's great. Maybe that's not, anything you want to do beyond that, and that's okay. But I think the important thing here is that there is no universal checklist or right answer that's going to force you into a box and say you have to do these things this way. It's going to give you, again, pathways. It's going to give you suggestions and solutions to consider, but it's not going to say, oh, if you want to make the world's best transportation project, you take these 12 prerequisites, and if you check them all, you're good to go. That's really not the intention here. So I've talked a little bit about certification, hinted about it, might as well talk about what that actually looks like. I've gone through this many times myself, along with our partners, our clients in the public sector realm. The process is, again, not reinventing the wheel here, very similar if you've ever been in any sort of these third-party verification programs of any sort. Firstly, you have to actually register the project. Second, you have to compile all of your documentation, all of your proof, so that somebody who has never actually seen your project or been part of your design team can prove that what you're saying is true. You submit that documentation, there's a review period, and then ultimately, if you pass all of those stages and it's acceptable, you would be given an award. So Envision, again, part of that flexibility conversation that I talked about just a few minutes ago, what you probably were able to guess from that, without prerequisites and with credit flexibility, the actual award thresholds are quite low in terms of what you might consider traditional percentages to be. If you're used to using something like LEED, platinum's the highest there, you're looking at like 80% plus of points. This is a lower number, but don't be fooled by that, because many of the credits that are available, you may just not ever want to see used for your specific application because it's not all that relevant. But the different award categories are listed there just for your understanding. And so if you can show, for example, that your project has achieved 35% of all the credits that are available to it, then you would be granted a silver award if you opted for doing the verification process. So let's talk a little bit about some examples. So firstly, in Ontario, this is a Municipal Engineering or Association of Engineers presentation. So let's talk about our home base here. So these are just some of the entities that are deploying Envision here in Ontario. Metrolinx, if you look at some of their public bid documentation, they have identified Envision as one of 3 sustainability frameworks that they will employ, along with LEED and the Toronto Green Standard. And they have said that they have used Envision on several projects to date. Much of that is not yet public knowledge, is my understanding, in terms of which specific projects, but we'll stay tuned on that one and see what Metrolinx tells us about that in the future. And then Kelly, obviously, was kind enough to organize this presentation. And as you can probably guess, the region of Durham has also been utilizing Envision to an extent, and they have actually trained a number of their staff. I believe it's over 20 across disciplines, and they were the first municipality in Ontario to officially become a member of the ISI. So some kudos there for the region of Durham. And looking at some projects that have already been certified here. So again, the first one was the Grand Bend Wastewater Treatment Facility. So if you've not been to Grand Bend, summertime is a great time to visit, and it is on the southwest part of Ontario. They're on Lake Huron. And so the owners here were the municipalities of Lambton Shores and South Huron. And the year of the award for this project was 2015, and it earned a platinum level award. Also, if you are in Southwest Ontario, you've ever crossed this bridge, which is the Windsor-Detroit crossing, known as the Gordie Howe International Bridge. This project more recently in 2021 also received a platinum award. So again, 2 very different projects serving very different functions, both achieving a platinum level certification. But my guess is, if you were to look at what credits they considered relevant and which ones they actually addressed, they're probably wildly different based on the needs of the project. And some topical news today, this project here, the second concession project, was actually just today the recipient of a bronze award under Envision. And this project is up in the township of East Gwillimbury, kind of in the Newmarket, that part of Ontario, just north of Toronto. And so this project, as shown on the map, is the expansion of a 6-kilometer transportation corridor. And this is really part of developing infrastructure to serve the needs of a very fast growing population. Everyone here in Ontario will know, we're experiencing hundreds of thousands of new residents entering our province every year. They need to go places, they need to go into development. And this road was a historical, kind of more rural road that was upgraded by the township in order to reflect and plan for some of that future growth. Some of the project details are listed here. So the total length is 6 kilometers, capital cost 56 million, and today it was just the recipient of the bronze certification. So congratulations to the York region and all the project team that worked on this project. And some features of the project, you're going to get some visuals, because one, this is a project that has some great pictures, and I think it's a really cool project. But you'll see here that as they were redeveloping this project, they added some additional features that are what I would consider to be non-traditional for these types of projects. One being an elevated wooden boardwalk and pedestrian bridge for cyclists and pedestrians. This was actually the first dedicated cycle track in the entire region. They also removed an at-grade train crossing as part of the GO train expansion, where the service frequency there is increasing. And again, on this restoration concept, the constructed wetland on site was also built what used to be a parking lot. And they also looked at the climate perspective to design these crossings to withstand the 100-year storm event. Here's just kind of the bird's eye view, where you're going to see that, and again, much we talked about the interconnectivity of infrastructure. Here you're seeing a railway, you're seeing a natural protected environment in the Rogers Reservoir, you're looking at active transportation for the elevated boardwalk and cycle tracks, you're looking at this enlarged road and bridge, and you're looking at the pumping station, a historic canal, and locks. So again, this is complex. There's a lot of things happening here and a lot of things that need to be considered in the context of the design. And that's part of why under Envision, this project was recognized with the award today. So I wanted to close on, this is the sustainability stuff, right? It's always like you should, this is good, it's better, you should think about these things. But really, we all live in a practical world. We all have issues we have to deal with day to day in our jobs. Why would you actually do this? What's the value that you might obtain? What does it do for people like the region of York or the region of Durham? What might this actually benefit you with? So these are the official points that the Envision kind of framework will tell you. I'm going to go through these. I'm going to tell you my own perspective, having worked on this a few times. But Envision tells us that the purpose here is that it's meant to give you a comprehensive set of criteria to consider. So take out the guesswork. You don't have to go research these things or be current or understand what's happening in the world across every infrastructure topic. That would be really a waste of time. Secondly, it's meant to incentivize higher performance. So again, the goal here is to look at projects that do obtain certification and ask the question, what did they do differently from what I'm doing, if anything? And if they're doing something different, what from that should I take and build into my next approach? The third part is that it's also meant to identify champions effectively. So if there are people who are taking, really leadership roles in some of these topics, by highlighting them, by promoting them, it's meant to also increase education and awareness by pointing people to people who might be experts that could help them with their problems. It's also meant to improve public buy-in and awareness to sustainable practices. So again, the purpose of any kind of framework or a certification type platform is to help people understand by looking at a label and saying, okay, they've done something different. That helps me understand the high level without having to be an expert on what could be a 5-year project that involved, hundreds or thousands of people. This is meant to kind of simplify that for the average user. It is also by necessity meant to strengthen interagency and project team collaboration through that integrated design concept. And finally, ideally, it's also supposed to help stakeholders understand that this is a reflection of good governance, good spending of public money, and accountability for what has been done. So those are the official points. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about my perspective, which is purely my perspective and not reflective of Lorette or the Canadian Society for Civil Engineers or Kelly or anybody else. This is just my perspective. And my perspective, which I'll share with you, is based on some of the projects that I've worked on. And 4 of them are listed here. One of them on the left-hand side is the Atlanta Water Supply Program, which received the Envision Gold certification. This was an upgrade of a historically underserviced park. And if you're a fan of some Hollywood movies, you might recognize the backdrop there, because this actually used to be an empty mining operation that was used in shows like The Walking Dead and The Hunger Games as a very impressive backdrop for movies that are filmed in Atlanta. They have converted this into a reservoir that will provide emergency backup water to the entire city of Atlanta for many numbers of days if there's ever any kind of drought event. The project on the right is the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority's low-level road. So this was a pretty complex project in a very geologically sensitive area in a very tight urban environment, where they were looking at improving rail shipping to the port while also promoting greater safety and protecting residents from noise impacts and other impacts from development. So that's a different transportation project. On the bottom left, another interesting project in the city of Surrey in BC, which is the first integrated municipal solid waste to what I will call renewable natural gas facility. So this actually takes the city's organic compost, it converts it into fuel, and that fuel is then entering into the natural gas system there in Surrey. So it's a pretty fascinating project and kind of a waste to energy type idea. And on the bottom right, again, I'll keep on the movie themes. If you've seen the movie Grease or any other movie that involves the LA River there, which as you will think of it as a big concrete encased, kind of grimy looking little tunnel underneath most of LA or the periphery of LA, what this project is meant to do is actually to naturalize sections of that concrete encased river and to capture stormwater and treat it and improve the water quality before releasing it into the ocean. So this is another fascinating project that was recently a Platinum Award winner. So my observations I would share with you is what's the value here, right? Like what can you actually get from this beyond just an award that you can put on your shelf, which is great. Everybody loves awards, but what can you actually do? Well, I think for me, what has become clear over time is that there isn't really a good understanding of what the word sustainability means. I don't understand it. It means all sorts of things. So the way I think that word means, you will probably think something means something different or slightly, a different definition that I would not think of. And often in projects, when we talk about these issues, what we need is a common language of understanding between disciplines, between generations, between languages, about what we're actually trying to accomplish and what actually is the objective. So having something to refer back to that we all have as a resource is a good thing. Like all things with projects, the earlier you implement a tool, the more likely you are to actually get a good outcome and the lower cost it's going to be. So if you're thinking about things like sustainability from day one, it is much easier to accomplish what you're looking for versus coming in at the very back end and saying, oh crap, we wish we had have done more with renewable energy, or we wish we had have done more to make this building more accessible. And we didn't do any of those things. So now we have to bring back the engineers and the architects and like totally rip out sections of design and do that all over again. But the important thing is that no matter where you are, you can enter in the continuum, right? Like you can look at this either as a backward looking thing and say, how well did we actually do on a project? And what can we learn from that to do differently the next time? That's fine, that's great. Or, maybe you want to look at it and say, I'm only interested in understanding what might be some good design guidelines for my project. I don't care about an award. I'm not interested in like publishing anything. I just want to look at this from the outset and give some of my partners and consultants guidance as to what I want. That's also good. Maybe you just want to look at it for your own organization and say, what are some minimum things that we should be doing that we're not doing now that every project's going to have to live up to? And I'm going to put those in my specifications, and that's what I want to do. That's also great. And again, you look at organizations like Laurette was saying, like Metro Vancouver, who've set a certification requirement for projects over a certain size. But my guess is projects that are below that size are still benefiting from the knowledge and experience of the same staff who work on those projects, who've worked on some of the larger ones as well. So all this to say is that, the value of this is not to get an award. The value of this is understanding what makes sense for you as an organization, what would help elevate your performance, what is achievable within the resources you have, and what do you all agree is something worth moving towards. And if you can identify that through using something like Envision, I would call that a huge success. And again, the impact of certification, what does it actually do? Well, there is this funny thing, and I'm sure many of you have identified this too. Documentation for projects tends to go missing a lot. And some of that is that different people hold different pieces. So sometimes consultants change or contractors change and their memory or their documents go with them. Sometimes you move offices, sometimes people retire. Sometimes there just wasn't a lot of diligence in the moment to what was being done because it didn't seem all that relevant at the time. What I have found in doing this is by looking at documentation requirements and having somebody who's consciously thinking about stuff like landscaping choices and project management minute meetings and all of these things, a sustainability charter, it does help you document what was actually accomplished and promote that knowledge transfer from one project to another. If you go back in time a few years later, you should be able to look at your submission or your records if you chose not to verify and say, hey, like this is what we did, this is what was valuable, this is what our team members wanted to record, and it's all there in one package. That I think is an understated value. The other thing is that if you have certification requirements, that does create a pathway for you to hold people to account, to say, look, you signed up for this, you gave me a budget and a fee and a timeline, and you said that you would help me accomplish this. And now I need you to do it. I need you to prove from the work that you've done that you've lived up to what you said you could do. And that's one way in terms of a contract that you can help maintain that. And then finally, perhaps the more obvious piece is that certification, getting the award has as much to do as communications as anything else. It is an excellent PR and comms tool. It helps to simplify and distill down all of the complexity that is real, and helps other stakeholders who know nothing about what you've done have a better understanding of what actually happened and how that stacks up versus some of the other standard activities that happen. And this is a big one. This came up a lot. This comes up a lot all the time. And one of the first comments that you'll hear back from anybody when they talk about looking at external sustainability frameworks is, well, I already do that. I'm already inherently sustainable. Or in my jurisdiction, in my region, we have a requirement for X. And that might be true. What I would say is that nothing is ever average. No jurisdiction is doing nothing. Every jurisdiction has its own kind of unique situation or history or proponents that have done some things that push them above what Envision considers the average. And the good thing, again, is that that's just fine. You're going to be over the baseline on some things. And if that doesn't offer you any value, then you look at the other things that you could do and learn from those opportunities and what the other peer organizations around North America or beyond are doing that maybe you want to make part of your baseline. So this is all about learning, and it's not about, again, just like, oh, well, I'm already doing some stuff that's better than the minimum, so therefore I'm good to go. That's not really the intention here. And you will find things that your organization is already doing a very good job of, and that's a good thing. It's something that should be celebrated. So I am going to close. So thank you for sitting with me for an hour and listening to us for an hour. Before we turn to the Q&A discussion, I wanted to just share with you a couple of resources. If you are interested in doing any further training opportunities, there are some options for you. The easiest one, or the most accessible one, is that you can do the training online. So there is an online option. The website for the Envision program is sustainableinfrastructure.org. And if you create an account there, in addition to accessing the manual, you can actually take these self-guided training sessions that would enable you to earn the credential that goes along with this framework. I will caution you that that credential does not instantaneously make you an expert on sustainable design. The purpose of the credential is to help you understand how to apply Envision and how the certification, all that stuff works. It's not necessarily going to teach you how to be the world's greenest stormwater design engineer whatsoever. So just keep that in mind. The other thing that is an option is that there are full-day training workshops that can be facilitated by the trainers that Laurette mentioned in her presentation. So both Laurette and I are trainers. There are a number of people out there who can do this. That's an interactive facilitated session in person that is typically accomplished in one day. So there's options for you. And also, if you sign up on the website, you also can get access to invitations for other webinars that are about education, credentialing, or just current topics in infrastructure design. Or there is also an annual kind of conference that you could get access to that is all about kind of current trends in sustainable design. And Laurette, I see you have rejoined us. There's something that I have not covered you'd like to add.
No, I was just going to add here that the exciting part in Ontario is that we have the McMaster program. And as part of the McMaster program, I'll drop a link also in the chat, but there is a required, it's a 3-day course focused on sustainable infrastructure as a continuing learning opportunity for professionals. As part of that broader credential, the Envision training is built into that as well. So if you're looking for something a bit broader, that might be another good option, and it is subsidized by the Ontario government. And if you're a CSCE member, there's an additional subsidy for you to participate in that. So I'll drop a link.
Excellent.
Awesome. So,
sorry, one more slide, Kelly, which was just that again, if you do want to sign up for an account, I gave you the wrong address actually, so you should go to envisioncanada.com to make sure you're part of the Canadian contingent. But yeah, so that's all the information there. You can check out that website, or again, you can just contact Laurette or I if you're looking for any kind of additional information. So I will stop there, Kelly, and I will say thank you again for letting Loretta and I share this with you today. I appreciated you joining the hour. We do have time for Q&A, but I will turn it back to Kelly.
Yeah, and I think we had one other question, which was answered. Lorette answered that one. So if anybody does have questions that are in the participants, they can raise their hands and ask away. And does anybody else have any questions? I don't see any hands.
Well, you know, I'm gonna prime one then, because everyone's always nervous to be the first, and so I will ask a question. The question is going to be, what does this cost me if I want to do it? You know, like, I think Kelly, you'd agree. That's the question that comes up. Is like, all right, great. Yeah, there's a book. Yeah, there's learnings, but what's it gonna, you know, hit my budget on?
Yep.
And I'll share my perspective, and then Loretta and Kelly, maybe you could share your perspective. But I would say, you know, it's hard to kind of pin a hard number on a process sometimes, right? So if you deploy a tool early on, like Envision, your actual net cost should be relatively limited. I think the ISI would tell you, we're looking with the total cost of application. If you wanted to do a certification, it's like 1 or 2% of the total capital cost of a project. Would you agree with that, Lorette?
Yeah, I don't think that's far off, and it depends on the scale of your project. Of course, the bigger your budget is, the lower the percentage, and smaller projects, the cost percentage-wise is a bit higher. There will be a ISI hosted webinar coming up in 2 weeks. So if you look on the website, you can find some information about the true cost of Envision, and several public agencies will be talking about that. So that might be another good opportunity to try and tease that out.
And I think in terms, again, of a first step and the option of education, the cost of that, again, for Lorette's comment, is relatively limited in terms of getting the credential. And Kelly, I know you and your team members did go through that certification much more recently than I had. So I wondered if you could speak to a little bit about what that kind of level of effort and cost and time was like for anyone who's interested.
Yeah, so I did it on my own, and it was the online learning on my own. So it didn't cost me too much. Now, with the region of Durham, we ended up doing a facilitated training over 2 half days. There was 28 people on the program course, and it was from every facet in our municipality. So from procurement, finance, planning, upper management, CAO's office, all the way through to construction operations, and all variants of works and facilities. So we really wanted to take advantage of that, and I think our budget was like $250 a person once we registered to be a member, and then the facility cost, I think, was I can't even remember how much it was, but it was minimal for that many people training, and it was worthwhile as well. So everybody that was interested in doing it and actually trying to see a different way of doing things, put their names down, and then we had more people training after the fact. So time wise, it wasn't very much. It was 2 half days. We have a training budget that actually was fine and accommodating. Directors and commissioners were on board. In the big picture, from a budget perspective, it's minimal, right? Considering what we're trying to do here, we're doing things, we're trying not to retrofit something that's going to cost millions and millions of dollars to retrofit something, instead of doing it right the first time. So if you look at it from that perspective, to spend $250 a person to train them and go through the process, I think it's money well spent. So that's just my perspective.
Okay, thank you. So again, I don't know if anybody has any questions that were unasked. We're happy to go through any comments, thoughts. I did see, thank you, Lorette, for addressing the question as well. That was asked before. So if there's any other individuals who'd like to ask, just let us know. And I will mention again, I think it was mentioned at the outset, but if you do have an existing credential or you would like to put this 1 hour session as for a continuing education certificate, then you can just let Loretta or I know, and we will get you a participation record for you. Okay,
Kelly,
I sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I posted the McMaster link there. For some reason, it doesn't let me post to all participants. If you have access to that, Kelly, if you just want to post that link.
Yeah, I think I do. I'll see if I can do that. Scroll that down. Whoops.
Yeah, I mean, from my side, if there's no other questions, I'm really excited to see activity happening more and more in Ontario. And like Eric's mentioned, if you or your organization would like to undertake some training, there's just different options. If you'd like to get a group together within your municipality or organization, get in touch, and we can help put you in touch with a trainer to offer kind of an in-person training session or a virtual training session, but specific to your organization.
That's it. So I think I posted, does everybody see the chat bar where it says the link to, do you guys see that?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. So if there's no other questions, this webinar will be posted on the MEA site. Going forward, it'll be uploaded eventually by ME, and it'll be there historically going forward. So if anybody wants to watch it again or share it with their colleagues, they can. So thank you very much to Eric and Lorette. I really appreciate it. That was wonderful. And I'm hoping that there will be some excitement and registration from the Envision process. Thank you. Thanks everybody for attending, and please reach out to Eric or Lorette or myself if you have any further questions. Thank you. Bye, everybody.